It's from one of these Tiemann's boys. Zachariah Tiemmann says, who's the most important, least known figure in history? I don't know if I know the answer to that question, but I think I could tell you who the most important, least known figure in American history is, modern American history. And I'm going to go with John Boyd on this one. John Boyd was a colonel in the United States Air Force. He was a fighter pilot, and he was a fighter instructor. He did not fly combat missions. He doesn't have any air-to-air victories. But John Boyd was called 42nd Boyd because when he was an instructor at Nellis Air Force Base, primarily in F-100s, my favorite airplane ever, I think, even more than the F-16, just because it was what the Thunderbirds were flying. It's a great-looking airplane. Looks like a muscle car. Boyd would be in an F-100, let's say, out at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, just north of Las Vegas. And Boyd had a reputation, and Boyd's reputation was 42nd Boyd. What did 42nd mean? 42nd Boyd meant that John Boyd, somebody mentioned Norman Borlaug, and you know what? You'll make the case for Borlaug in a minute because he would be second. But John Boyd basically would say to any fighter pilot, to the best fighter pilots in the world, not just American fighter pilots in the world, he'd make them a bet, and the bet would go like this. You can be behind me, 200-300 yards behind me, in a kill position, in the kill position, and when you're in position, ready to shoot me down, we'll say, fights on, and when we say fights on, I will shoot you down. With you behind me in the kill position, I will shoot you down within 40 seconds, and if I don't, I'll pay you $20 and I'll give you a $20 steak dinner. And scores, if not hundreds of guys took him up on that bet, and Boyd never lost. Every single time, the second that they said, fights on, Boyd was out of there, and 40 seconds later, he was behind the guy who used to be behind him and shot him down. Now, this is kind of like the RAFs thing. When you reach that level of expertise, you're not playing this. You're not like somewhat better than the next guy, or 10% or 20% or 50% better than the next guy. When you are that much better, when you can make that bet and win all the time, you're now a guy with a pistol. You're not like a swordsman versus the second best swordsman. You're a guy with a gun. He's got a sword, you got a gun. You're going to win every time. Every time. So 42nd Boyd understood something about air combat that no one else understood. And if that were all that Boyd understood, he'd be a genius. But he's much, much, much smarter than that. What Boyd understood that allowed him to defeat opponents with that degree of consistency was two things, although the theories came to him separately, and he didn't understand the second one except instinctively. I'll get to the second one in a minute. Let's talk about his first theory. Boyd's first theory was called energy maneuverability theory. And Boyd basically was an engineer, not just a fighter pilot. In other words, he wasn't just a warrior, he was a warrior scholar. He was a warrior priest. Boyd basically wanted to know why it was that in Korea, the Americans had a 14-to-1 kill ratio over the communists, but in Vietnam it had dropped to 2-to-1, and in some places 1-to-1. Why? Why? Well, it turned out, no surprise, two reasons. Number one, the weapons were different, and number two, the warriors were different. The training was different because the flesh is uniform. The hardware is the same. So between a 14-to-1 kill ratio in Korea and a 2-to-1 kill ratio in Vietnam, something had happened to our weapons and something had happened to our training. What happened to the weapons in this case being aircraft, was the F-86 Sabre was the weapon that we used primarily in the Korean War against the MiG-15. And we had a 12-to-1 kill ratio in Korea. By the time we got to Vietnam, the primary air weapon was the F-4 Phantom, and that had a 2-to-1 kill ratio over the MiG-21. There were a number of different things that Boyd looked at. He understood that the F-4 didn't have guns on it, which meant that you had to engage with missiles, and the missiles in the 1960s were very unreliable. That significantly influenced the kill rate. The rules of engagement said that you had to visually identify, you had to see the red stars on the wings of that airplane before you could shoot at it. That's Johnson's contribution to the Vietnam War lasting 10 years. So the rules of engagement favored the enemy in a way that they hadn't favored the enemy before, because in Korea both sides had guns, there were no missiles. So who's got the best gunfighting platform. But what Boyd really realized when he really got down to brass tacks was that the F-86 had a gigantic wing on it. It had a huge wing on it, very big wing, much more wing than it needed. And what Boyd realized was that this extra lift that this wing provided in a turn meant that that airplane could outturn the MiG in virtually every airspeed that they would encounter. That extra wing on the F-86 Phantom, F-86 Sabre, gave it such a turning advantage that it was a superior weapon. And so you had a better weapon in the Korean War, and you had a better warrior, because most of these pilots who were fighting in Korea 5 years earlier were shooting down Germans in P-51 Mustangs, another excellent, excellent weapon. So you had highly skilled warriors who were highly trained and highly experienced with a very, very good weapon in their hands. It's no wonder they won 12-1. By the time you got to Vietnam, the airplanes had gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bulkier and heavier, and they kept making them go faster in a straight line, but the wings got smaller and smaller relative to the total weight of the airplane, and no guns. And so by the time you got to Vietnam, you had the American pilots in these big, thundering, heavy school bus type airplanes, including the F-111, which was a bomber. They wanted to make that a fighter airplane because there's not going to be any dogfights anymore. We'll all do it with missiles. Well, it turns out that nobody gave the Vietnamese that memo. So what was happening was the Vietnamese were making airplanes that were lighter than the American airplanes, and the lighter airplanes could turn tighter than the American airplanes, and this is what most people overlook when they get down to what Boyd was really understanding about energy management. Not only could they turn tighter than the American airplanes, generally speaking, the Soviet airplanes, those stupid Russian airplanes, because they were lighter, could change their energy state faster. They could accelerate faster. They could decelerate faster. They were less massive, so they could change their energy state faster. So they had a much better weapon than we did. And if you don't believe me, look at the names that the American pilots gave the airplanes that they were given in Vietnam. The two primary aircraft in the run of the Vietnam War, the primary air-to-air aircraft was the F-4 Phantom. The F-4 Phantom had the nickname the Smoking Thunderhog because its jet engines produced a black smear that was 4 miles long and was just basically a black arrow pointing to the airplane saying, shoot here. You got to see an airplane before you can engage it. The F-4 Phantom was a gigantic, heavy, slow, poorly turning, wasn't slow in a straight line, had power, but couldn't turn to save its life. And up against that was the MiG-21, much, much lighter. And once that MiG-21 got inside a missile range, which was most of the time because the missiles weren't very good at all, the Sparrow, the earliest version of the AIM-7 Sparrow was 10% kill ratio on a good day. For every missile you launched, 1 out of 10 was going to hit. So you've got worthless weapons, and now, once the planes are close enough, now it's a turning dogfight. So not only do the Russian planes have an advantage on the ability to turn and accelerate and decelerate, the American planes don't even have any guns on them. The Navy fighters, the F-8 Crusader, had guns on them, and they did significantly better than the F-4s. So Boyd is looking at his friends getting shot down in Vietnam all the time, and he does a briefing. He does the first of many briefings to the Pentagon, and what he does is he goes in there, and he basically has prepared a slide, a physical slide that's projected on a wall for every single aircraft in the U.S. inventory and every single aircraft in the Soviet inventory. And let's remember, we're in the mid-'60s now, and Americans are so sure of our superiority over the Russians because we built better stuff, because we're smarter than they are. We are smarter than they are. But we got arrogant, we got lazy, and we got stupid. And we were building big, fat airplanes that did less and less and less. So Boyd compared slides, and Boyd basically projected these slides on the wall. And here's an F-4 on one side of the slide, here's a MiG-21 on the other side of the slide. And everywhere that the MiG-21 was superior, he put in red, and every airspeed where the F-4 was superior, he put in blue. And time again, as he took a look at the actual weapons that were being used in the Vietnam War, the entire wall was red. The planes that the Soviets were building were better in virtually every airspeed engagement. They were better weapons than ours. Our guys weren't getting trained with guns. We didn't have Top Gun school. We didn't have the experience of World War II, which had trained the Korean pilots so well. So we didn't have any way to train these guys in dogfights. And with most combat, you find out that most guys are killed on their first mission or two. Most people are killed in combat before they learn enough to keep their head down, essentially. So Boyd says we've got worse weapons and we've got worse training. That's why we're getting creamed. So the first thing that Boyd did was he said, look at this slide. See all this block of red? That's where the MiG-21 is going to outturn the F-4, and if you fight at those airspeeds, you're going to die. But look at this little stretch of blue here. See that little tiny little blue margin right in there? Yes. That's 450 knots off the top of my head. Right? Boyd would say at 450 knots, the F-4 has a tighter turning radius than the MiG-21, or let's say the MiG-17, because let's just say the MiG-17 didn't have hydraulics. So the pilot couldn't put enough force on the stick. Once you got to a certain airspeed, the hydraulics of the F-4 of the American airplane would help, would actually win. So Boyd would say, look, here's a little window. Between 410 knots and 460 knots, the F-4 can turn tighter than the MiG-21, but any faster than that we don't, and any slower than that we don't. And if we don't fight these commie bastards at 420 knots, we're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to keep dying like you're dying now. And the Pentagon didn't want to hear this, and God knows the defense contractors didn't want to hear it, because they were saying your planes are worse than the Russians. But somebody listened, and Boyd started a small group of people in the Pentagon called the Fighter Mafia. And he found some acolytes, including guys named, I want to say Sperry, and a couple of others who found religion listening to Boyd. And this message did get out. And so they started training American pilots to say, engage the enemy at these airspeeds, and if you're slower than that, get out of the fight. And if you're faster than that, slow it down. But don't try to outturn a MiG-21 unless you're doing this particular range of airspeeds, because you're going to get killed. And sure enough, once it became understood where those little bands where our airplanes were actually better, that's where they started fighting. And it went back up to 7-1. Because we started putting guns on airplanes. We started training pilots with other pilots who had been in dogfights to win. Get them through their first or second or third dogfight, and they're going to win. They get killed when they're novices, when they're rookies. Train them hard. And so Top Gun comes along, and Red Flag comes along. We start training people with guns. Boyd understood this. That's why he could shoot down anybody in 40 seconds. Because Boyd didn't care what plane he was in, didn't care what plane you were in. He knew each airplane so well that he said, well, I'm in a F-100 and he's in a Crusader. Means I need to engage him at 325 knots. So I'll take the flight to 325 knots at 8,000 feet. That's where I'll beat him, and that's what he would do. So he did get the Secretary of Defense on the side, and one, as Wild Goose pointed out, and one of the people that he came strongly on his side was a man named Dick Cheney, who became an absolute acolyte of Boyd's. We'll get to Dick Cheney in a minute. So, energy management theory was Boyd's theory of why airplanes worked and didn't work in combat against each other. And if all he had done was come up with energy management theory, he would already be one of the most important Americans you've never heard of. But energy management theory also meant that you could design new airplanes. And so Boyd decided he was going to design a new airplane. And he was going to design an airplane that was going to shoot down other airplanes, and that's all it was going to do. And he looked at the F-86 and he said, what is it about the F-86? It's got so much more wing. It's got so much more lift that it can turn and it can accelerate. It's got a good thrust-to-rate ratio. So Boyd designed an airplane that had nothing but thrust and nothing but wing. And it didn't carry bombs, and it didn't carry hard points for bombs. It didn't carry anything other than a big wing and big engines and a gun and a couple of missiles. And that aircraft was called the F-15. The F-15 Eagle has a combat record. The F-15 Eagle's not 2-1 in combat like it was in Vietnam. It's not 7-1 like it was as Boyd's techniques started getting into the air. The F-15 was designed by Boyd and the rest of these guys. The F-15 didn't have a 12-1 kill ratio. Last information I heard on the F-15, the record for the F-15 in air-to-air combat is 172 wins against 0 losses. You just want to get up and leave the room. 172 wins, no losses. None. No losses. That's what happens when you let a guy like Boyd make decisions on what kind of airplanes to buy. Boyd also had a lot to do with the F-16, which originally was a Rapier. Just very light airplane. You look at the prototype, the YF-16, the plane's barely there. Boyd loved it because it was inexpensive and it was so light, so fast, so quick. Nobody could change it. But again, the Pentagon comes along and starts saying, well, the F-15 is a big platform and it's got a big wing. Let's put some bombs on it. Let's put some more weight on it. Let's put some more fuel on it. Let's put a second guy in the back. Let's do the same to the F-16. Let's make it heavier so it can do more and more and more stuff. And Boyd basically just kind of threw his hands up in the air and said, whatever. Nevertheless, The design genius in the F-15 and the F-16 is so strong that those airplanes are unmatched to this day. That alone would have been enough to make Boyd a legend, but that's just getting started with Boyd. Boyd then had his second breakthrough theory, which was even more important than energy management theory, and that's Boyd's theory of OODA, the OODA loop. Boyd spent the first half of his career with energy management theory trying to understand how to make a superior weapon. And he did. And then the real genius kicked in, because then what Boyd basically did was he said, okay, we've got a much better weapon than they do, and now we're starting to beat them the way we should be beating them. But then Boyd went a step beyond that, and as Viper points out, the A-10, another legendary airplane, was Boyd as well. What does this plane need to do? The A-10 needs to fly slowly. It doesn't have to go supersonic. It needs to be slow, it needs to be tough, and it needs to be redundant. There are going to be people shooting at it. We don't want to go buzzing off the battlefield at Mach 2. We want to be able to go slow enough so that we can see tanks and put a gunfire on them. They built an entire airplane around a gun. The gun's the size of a bus. They built the airplane around the gun. You look at the A-10 from the front. I think we talked about this on the Pictures Worth a 1,000-word episodes. The landing gear strut on the front of the A-10 is offset to the side because the gun's in the middle of the airplane. So he had the A-10 as well. But back to the second part. Boyd had the genius to not only say, I'm going to design the best fighter in the world, the F-15. Then he said, now what happens if you have two guys and they both have F-15s? Who's going to win? How do we know? Well, one guy's going to get more training. What does that mean? What does it mean? It means we're going to train a guy so he wins in dogfights. How? If the two planes that the pilots are flying are absolutely equal, if they're holding equal length and equal strength swords, how can one guy be consistently better than the other guy if the weapons are equal? And he basically said, okay, this is a magnificent thought. Boyd basically said, if one guy is making his decisions faster than the other guy, it doesn't even matter if he makes mistakes every now and then, because as long as he's making his decisions faster, he'll be able to correct his mistakes faster than the other guy. He realized that it wasn't so much a sit back and get the perfect picture thing as it was speed. It was the reaction time. And this was his theory called OODA. And there's an OODA loop. And it's called a loop because it's a series of instructions where the last instruction comes back to the first instruction. So the first instruction in OODA, O-O-D-A, is observe. So if you've got two guys, you got a red jet and a blue jet, and they're the exact same jet, and they're coming at each other, and it's fights on, what does OODA tell you? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to observe. Where's the other enemy airplane? Where is it? You have to find it. You have to observe it, right? That's the first thing you have to do. You have to spot it. And the first guy who spots the enemy airplane wins. I don't know what the actual number was, but I think in World War II it was something like 6 to 1 of the kills that were made in World War II were killed by a plane shooting down another plane where the victim plane never saw the attacking plane. They just shot out of the sky. Didn't even know there was another plane out there. So you got to observe. That's the first thing you have to do. Where is the other guy? Where is he? I got him. Okay, he's at 11 o'clock high. Observe, right? Orient means, all right, I know where he is. Which way is he going, and which way am I going? What is our relative motions? What is our relative positions? Who's got the altitude advantage? Who's got the airspeed advantage? Altitude can be converted into airspeed. Higher is generally better because you can trade that altitude for airspeed. So now I've oriented. He's at 11 o'clock. He's moving in the opposite direction. He's higher than I am, and he's faster than I am. He's got an advantage, so I've oriented. Then I have to decide, given the orientation, after I've observed and oriented, now I have to make a decision. What is the best maneuver I can do when he's got a superior altitude, superior airspeed, and go in the other direction? Well, let's just say it's a left brake or a left high G yo-yo. Let's just say, whatever. So you make that decision. That's the D in OODA, and then you act. You have to commit to the action. You can't just think about it some more. You've observed, there he is. You've oriented, he's going that way, I'm going this way. You've decided the best maneuver I can take is this maneuver, and then rather than sitting and thinking about it for a while, maybe there's something better I can do. Do it. Act. So he does it. So if the blue pilot is making this OODA decision, observe, orient, decide, and act, that he's doing it once every 2 seconds, and the other guy is doing it once every 5 seconds, even if the blue pilot makes a mistake, he can correct the mistake before the other guy can capitalize on the mistake. And as the blue pilot, who's cycling through this OODA loop faster than the red pilot is, as he starts to get into a kill position, then his advantage in speed is fatal 100% of the time, because he is correcting his tactics, he's correcting his position faster than the red pilot can even observe him. In other words, blue pilot now is observing, orienting, deciding, and acting before the red pilot can even observe him. And so as the fight goes on and on and on, the blue pilot gains more and more and more of an advantage until finally the blue pilot wins every time because he's going through the OODA loop faster. Swell. Grand, that's magnificent for dogfights, right? Except that it's not just dogfights. Boyd realized, what if we were to take this attitude and put it on the battlefield with tanks and entire armies? Boyd realized then it wouldn't matter if we make a tactical mistake. It wouldn't matter if we were in an area that was leading us into an error, so long as we were cycling our decisions faster. If we were reacting to information in real time faster than they are, then we'll win. Because if we make a mistake, we'll correct it faster than they will. If they make a mistake, we're going to leap on their mistakes. They're never going to recover from their mistakes. And so the story goes. This may be unfair to Schwarzkopf. I've heard some evidence that this is true, but the story goes that Schwarzkopf in Gulf One decides he's going to use traditional American strength, which is firepower. It's just masses of artillery and tanks and strength and attrition. He's got a bigger fist than they do, and since you've got the bigger fist and you've got the harder hit, what you're going to do is you're just going to put them right in front of the Iraqi army. You're going to go right through their hard front lines and hit them as hard as you can and use our advantages. And apparently, this was the battle plan, and Boyd got to Cheney on it and said, our guys are going to get killed doing this. We're going to win, but we're going to lose guys doing this. And Boyd said, we don't want to hit them where they're strongest. And Boyd said, we don't even want to hit them where they're weakest, which is what you would think the military maxim would be. That's what Nathan Bedford Forrest would have told you in the Civil War, hit them where they're weakest. Boyd said, don't even hit them where they're weakest. Boyd said, hit them where they expect it the least. Now, that is a profound insight. Because if you hit them where they expect it the least, then you've got them, then the battle's over. What does that mean? Well, let's say that the Iraqis are strongest on their front line. They've been fortifying it for a year. Let's say that they hit them on the weakest end, which is the flank, which is where they expect it to be, although they know they're weak there. But Boyd basically said, what if you hit them 200 miles in the rear? What if you blew up an ammo dump or a bridge or engaged a tank column off the map? They didn't even know what's out there. There's something in the back, 200 miles behind the line, just blows up. What would happen then? Boyd's theory was that what would happen would be the Iraqis would turn around essentially and go, what the hell just happened back there? And they'd look back there and they'd see that something's on fire because they got hit where they expected it the least. It's going to knock them off their game. They're not looking at the front lines anymore. They're not worried about the front lines. So what the hell happened back there? So they're going to start sending some forces back there to find out what happened. But by the time those forces get back there, the guys on our team that caused that destruction are gone. They're not there anymore. We're thinking we're cycling so much faster than they are. So they converge on a vacuum. The forces that caused that destruction aren't there anymore. And now something completely on the other side of the map just blows up. So what is the operational effect of this? The operational effect is very simple. It means that the Iraqis never, ever have the one thing you have to win in war, and that is the initiative. We're not playing according to the Iraqi battle plan. They're playing according to our battle plan. They are reacting to things that they're not expecting. It knocks them off their game. They're particularly vulnerable to this kind of thing because they're very centralized command and control. You start knocking out command and control lines, all of a sudden pieces are just disappearing off the board for Saddam. He doesn't even know what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. We know what's going on, but they don't have a clue. Things are just falling apart. And over a very short period of time, hours, really, hours, over the course of hours, the Iraqi command structure is utterly demoralized because their defensive plan has fallen apart. Pieces are just disappearing off the board. They're just vanishing, and they don't know why. So they get more and more panicked. The more panic they get, the slower their decisions become, the more confusion they have, the more time it takes for orders to come from the top down. They don't know what's going on. Units that used to be in place aren't in place. The Americans that used to be in one position aren't there anymore. And so the Americans are going through this decision loop so fast, and the Iraqis are getting slower and slower and slower. that ultimately the entire Iraq army just collapses, and they all get on that road out of Basra, and they're running for their lives, and they're carrying chandeliers in the back of their tanks, and they're carrying all this loot, and they've raped and murdered the Kuwaitis, and they're running for their lives, and they're all in a line, and in come the A-10s and the F-15 Strike Eagles, and just mince them. And this is another interesting lesson. It's not directly related to Boyd, but once that road to Basra started to be hit, once we blocked the front of that column and we just started working that column with Boyd's airplanes, with the F-15s flying top cover, where there is no Iraqi Air Force anymore, because no Iraqi Air Force is going to get through the F-15s. It's too good an airplane. Our pilots are too good. The A-10s that are designed to blow up ground targets are working that convoy, and they're just mincing it. And what actually happened was, this is a really profound thing, what actually happened was the Americans on the scene called off the fight. It's an awful lot of fundamental cultural decency to just say, look, this isn't even combat anymore. This is a massacre. Now we don't need to hurt them anymore. They're done. That's remarkable, I think, really remarkable and admirable. And that's what happened. So if you want to know why, Boyd is the most important American you've never heard of, it's because he got Americans' mind away from firepower and into maneuver. He studied everybody. He studied Sun Tzu. He studied Clausewitz. He studied Rommel. He studied Guderian. He studied the term that the Germans used during when they invented Blitzkrieg, and I forget what the German term is, but it's called fingertip control. It's that kind of precise control where you're just using just the tips of your fingers to move these tanks around. Fingertip control. Water flowing downhill, avoiding big rocks flowing in the ravines, going away from the strong parts, getting behind them. We'll mop them up later, cut them off. What Boyd realized was this was a way to win wars without taking the kind of casualties that we usually take in a situation like Iwo Jima. This is what actually happened. And it happened in Gulf War, and the Iraq resistance just simply collapsed. And that's why we won the war with, I forget what the casualty rate was in Gulf War. I think we lost something like 160 people killed, and 110 of those or 120 of those was from that fluke Scud missile hit on one of our barracks. It's just a fluke. A Scud got shot down and the warhead landed on a barracks and killed 100 people. We would have taken essentially no casualties in defeating the fourth biggest army in the world. Schwerpunkt. Thank you, George Friedland. That was the term that he studied, Schwerpunkt, fingertip control. That kind of precision. And so, well, maybe it was a fluke. Except that along comes the Iraq invasion 10 years later, 15 years later, in 2003. And Tommy Franks, an artilleryman. Artillery is not known for its mobility, although there was a Confederate general who moved his artillery so quickly and so close to the enemy lines that the general said you should put bayonets on those cannons. But generally, artillerymen are solid and staid and kind of, by the book. Tommy Franks was given command of the invasion of Iraq. Tommy Franks used this exact same strategy. Tommy Franks took the U.S. Army into Iraq. Normally, what we did with Gulf War, you'd start by softening up the targets with air power. You have a 3-month air campaign, I guess it was, in Gulf War or longer, 6 months maybe. Bomb the hell out of them and soften them up, and then finally comes the invasion. Tommy Franks said, no, we're not going to give them any warning. I'd rather they didn't have any warning. I don't think they're going to need to be softened up. We're going to blow past them. Tommy Franks just basically listened to Pat and said, we're going to go through them like crap through a goose. And Tommy Franks took armored divisions. He didn't even have the troops he wanted. He didn't even have the 4th Armored Division, the really good one. He wouldn't let them come in through Turkey. So he took the 3rd. And Tommy Franks moved so fast with those tanks that the Iraqis never knew where they were. And if you want to know how Boyd won the Iraq invasion, the Kinetic War, years after he died, you know it by Baghdad Bob, the propaganda spokesperson for Saddam Hussein, giving real-time press briefings to the International Press Corps and saying that the Americans are 450 miles away at the border at some Iraqi town. And all of a sudden you hear explosions because we're not 450 miles away. American tanks are in the center of Baghdad. That's another thing that you got from Boyd. You can't put tanks in a city. They're not designed for city. Tanks are designed for mobile, high-speed warfare out on open plains. Deserts are perfect for tanks. Fields, that's what tanks are for. That's what you want to use your tanks for. Tommy Frank said, I completely agree. But they're not going to be expecting tanks downtown, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to hit them where they don't expect it. We're going to put American armored column in the middle of Baghdad and see how they like it. They didn't like it at all. They ran away. We took over the airport. Once we took Baghdad International Airport, we get all the supplies we want in there. Game's over. 100 casualties and 200 killed, something like that. Right. And all of that happened before the resistance. Was the two greatest military victories in modern history, back to back, Gulf War and Iraq invasion. Spectacular. And I personally believe they're due to John Boyd and his followers, guys like Sperry. And there's one more thing about Sperry. It's important to point out because you don't want to get too full of yourself or too full of a head on this. But I still, reading this book, I'm utterly amazed that this is true, but people are in the military. This won't be a surprise to you. I'm astonished that American generals could do what I heard that they did in this book called Boyd, the fighter pilot who changed the face of warfare. What we found through Boyd's accolades, primarily through, I'm pretty sure his name was Sperry. The Marines, by the way, as Joseph A.K. points out, the Marines adopted Boyd. In fact, the Marines made Boyd essentially an honorary Marine. His picture hangs in the Marine Hall of Fame. He's the only person from another service, I believe, who's got that distinction. Certainly the only person from the Air Force. Because the Marines loved him because he saved Marines' lives. He saved Army lives. He saved thousands of American lives. Thousands. Taught Americans how to fight battles in a way that we hadn't fought them before. But Boyd's accolades were guys like real iconoclasts like Sperry, and he was instrumental in the development of the M2. The M1 Abrams is a main battle tank. It's designed to be a big gun that moves fast and kills other tanks. And the Bradley, the M2, is an armored personnel carrier. That's what the troops ride into to go into battle. It's got a smaller gun, still a pretty significant gun, but basically, it's an armored and tracked bus that's designed to get troops into battle at high speed and keep up with the tanks and provide protection for the soldiers inside, certainly against small arms and RPGs and that kind of thing. Well, as it turns out, because of the nature of bureaucracies and because of the nature of human psychology and everything else, and because the people that make good political generals are not the people that make good battlefield generals and vice versa, it turned out that the M2 program, the Bradley, was run by a bunch of political generals, and they had their careers to look after, and they wanted that third set of stars or 4 stars on their shoulders. And so these American generals, who at one time had been soldiers, were lying about the M2. And here's some of the ways they were lying about the M2. It turned out that the M2 had enormous design deficiencies. And guys like Sperry said, we can't send our soldiers out in these things. They're death traps. They're going to get killed out there. An American general said, no, they're perfectly fine. There's nothing to worry about. One of the problems with the Bradley was something called spalling. Spalling is when a round hits the outside of armor, and maybe the armor will stop the round from coming in and penetrating the crew section. But spalling means that the force of the impact of the shell against the armor, even though the armor stops the shell, the inside of the armor splinters and metallic shards go flying throughout the entire interior of the tank, which is generally frowned upon by the crews. They're not fond of that when that happens. So the quick aside, when the very first tanks were built, if you look at the crews that the British wore, the outfits that the British wore in the very first tanks that ever went into battle, they wore these. They looked like armored knights. They had like metallic meshes over their face because of the spalling, because of the rounds hitting the tank, not coming through the armor, and just making the inside of a tank just a series of flying metal shards. So anyway, the M2 was experiencing spalling issues. And the M2 had an uncomfortable affinity for exploding when it got hit by an RPG round. So here's what the Pentagon did. The Pentagon denied the spalling. The Pentagon, during field testing for the M2, one of the things that the M2 had to prove in order to be okayed and put into production was they had to fire an RPG against the M2, and the RPG had to be defeated by the armor of the M2. And what the American generals in the Pentagon did was they fired an RPG against the M2, but they didn't fire a Russian RPG. They fired a Czechoslovakian RPG of the same design, looked the same, to all intents and purposes was the same. The warhead was about a third as powerful as the Russian warhead. So they intentionally used a low-grade weapon rather than the weapon that it would actually be up against, because if they used the weapon it would be actually up against, the program would fail and they would lose their star and they'd be out of a career. And of all the things the Pentagon did, the one that really just, I just have a hard time believing. I just have a hard time actually believing it. But it's true. The Pentagon, during the test to see whether the Bradley would explode when it was hit with a round, filled the fuel tanks up with water. And they conducted the tests of the M2 with fuel tanks filled with water. Because if they'd been filled with diesel fuel, the vehicle would explode. So they didn't fill it with diesel fuel, they filled it with water so that it would pass the test. If it passed the test, it would go into production, they'd get their star, their careers would be continuing, and if soldiers were killed by the dozens or hundreds in exploding vehicles, that was a problem downstream. We'll worry about that later. Those are American generals that made that decision. And it was guys like Sperry, who were civilians, who basically said, no. No. Sperry went to the press. He went over their head. And Cheney was a big help in this, I believe. He said, no, we're going to conduct actual tests, and we're going to have the press there. And sure enough, they shot rounds against the M2, and the inside just completely shattered into metal shards. So you know what they did? They retrofitted the inside of the M2 with a carbon fiber interior shell that dramatically, maybe almost completely reduced this spalling of metal shards. And they redesigned the fuel tanks, and they redesigned the armor, and they made the M2 a much, much, much better APC than it was originally because of Boyd. G. William here says, is that not treason? Of course it's treason. What else do you call it? What else can you call it? Of course it's treason. You're sending your soldiers into battle in weapon systems that you know are defective, and you're covering up the defects for your own personal political gain. It's treason. Of course it's treason. Of course it's treason. And a follow-up question here by, was it Karsten Mueller? 16 says, am I wrong in thinking that we now have mostly political generals? No, you're not wrong in thinking it. Why do you think, how do you think it's possible that chaplains are being pulled out of the military and that soldiers are being prosecuted for sharing their religious beliefs? And how do you think it's possible that the Muslim Brotherhood got the word Muslim, Islam, jihad, hudna, removed from the threat assessment manuals? They're just not in there anymore. It's like trying to go ashore in Normandy and you can't say German, you can't say Nazi, you can't say Wehrmacht, can't say Luftwaffe. Of course it's treason. There's no other word for it. These are political creatures in uniform. They're not soldiers in the way we understand soldiers. The guys who are good in combat don't do well in politics. And Boyd retired as a colonel instead of as a major general, which is what he should have retired as, because he made waves and he embarrassed people. So he retired as a colonel. They called him the ghetto colonel because Boyd lived in a ghetto. He lived in a ghetto with his family. He got divorced. His kids hated him. His wife hated him. His kids still hate him because they lived in the ghetto. And the reason they lived in the ghetto was because he saved so much money by living in the ghetto. He was able to buy all of these rare books by von Clausewitz and by Sun Tzu and by Rommel and Guderian. It cost money. He had to pay for it out of his own pocket. That's how Boyd was called the ghetto colonel, because he spent his rent money buying the books that he needed to save thousands and thousands of American lives to this day. And it's not just the soldiers in the APCs. If you don't win the fight in the sky, if you don't have the F-15 and the F-16, if you don't have air superiority, then it doesn't matter how good your fighting vehicles are. If the enemy is up there with air superiority, they own the skies, and those guys in the tanks and those guys in the APCs are going to be killed. It doesn't matter how good the tank is. He saved thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. And he taught us how to fight war. He basically said we shouldn't be sending American boys one-to-one with Russian boys. Our kids are worth more than that. That's why we spend so much money on their weapons systems and their training. That's why the AR-15, the M4, is the debate between the AR-15, the M16 basically, and the AK-47 will go on forever, and no matter which side I pick, somebody's going to immediately say I'm wrong. But one thing we can agree on is that the M16 is a precision weapon. It's more prone to jamming, although it's much better than it used to be. And it is a precision weapon with a smaller round that is designed to engage at longer range with more accuracy, because our guys are trained to kill the enemy before they come into range, before they become inside effective AK-47 range. We want to drop them. And one of the most amazing things about watching ground combat today is if you watch just the regular soldiers now in the field, every single one, it's a minor thing. Most people don't pick it up. It's enormously important. You look at guys in Gulf War, and if you look at them in the early days of the Iraq invasion, and they're carrying M16s, newer models, less prone to jam, with iron sights. They've got that traditional handle that gives, and the raised front sight that gives the M16 such a definitive look. But they're looking down the barrel of what's called iron sights, because it's just two pieces of iron, and just like the bad guys have with their AK-47, we light up the two pieces of iron, and our rifle's a little more accurate than theirs are. But you look at our guys going into combat today, and virtually every one of them has got optics. Even the optics on the machine guns on the M60s and the saws have optics. They've got red dot optics. They've got 3 power magnifiers. Why is that important? It's important because with optics, our soldiers can engage and kill enemy soldiers before they have any essentially real chance to hurt our guys with the AK-47s. Our guys have to kill them by a factor of 10 to 1. Our guys are worth more than their guys are. You may not find that morally pleasing, but I don't care. I'm not obligated to defend Iraqi soldiers or Russian soldiers. These are my people, and that's how we fight. Our guys are better, and we have fewer of them. And so we got to give them the best weapons so they can kill their guys before they get into killing range. It's the whole idea of the optics on the AR-15. It's the whole idea of the weapon systems on the F-15s. We're going to be outnumbered in the sky by 5 to 1. We've got to do better than them. We've got to do better than them by a wide margin, not just for economic reasons and not just for military reasons, for moral reasons. We want our citizens to come home. It's that simple. So I'll go with Boyd. And you know what? I think I'll make this the first question on the next one, because I'm going to finish these up next week. I think I've got an open week. I don't think I have to be out of here anytime. We're going to take the same question next week, and we're going to get it, and I'm going to answer separately. I don't think I'll answer quite as long or as passionately, but we'll take a look at maybe the least known important figure in history. Is also another American by the name of Norman Borlaug, who died just very recently, who wasn't a warrior at all. He was an agronomist. He was a scientist. He invented a way to feed the world. Billions of people are alive today because of Norman Borlaug. Nobody knows who he is.